Well, thanks, Rick, and thank you, Andre, and all of the other students that have organized this event today. It's a real pleasure to be back at Waterloo, as Rick mentioned, not the building that I went to architecture school in, but a much lovelier one, actually. And just to clarify on two things that Rick said, one is, writing is always a mix of pleasure and pain somehow, as I think most writers will tell you. Maybe Lisa has a different take on that. But I discovered at Waterloo that that going through architecture school, I didn't have much of a talent for design, actually, but I did have a talent for writing. And that became clear when I found myself in the last years of studio trading help with my classmates. I would help them write their project descriptions, and they would help me touch up my renderings so that they looked acceptable for design reviews. So I thought, maybe I have something there. The other point of clarification is that I'm quite recently the editor-in-chief of Canadian Architect. So this event comes at an interesting time when I myself am just discovering what that job entails. So I thought for this brief presentation that I would just do a kind of walkthrough of how an issue of Canadian architecture gets shaped, and maybe throughout that in the discussion that follows, we can talk about how you might see yourselves participating in that process. So this is the cover of the first issue that I was completely responsible for, which is the January issue that just came out. But what I did want to talk about in this presentation is actually, I thought it'd be more exciting to walk you through the issue that's about to come out, so that you have a kind of on-the-scenes view of something. So this very boring-looking graphic is the document that's almost constantly open on my computer, and it's a planning diagram, and I've got one for each month of the year, and it's where start to juggle and figure out what's coming up for the upcoming issues. So I don't know if I have a pointer here. Oh, maybe not. So there's the parts that are a bit dull, but crucial for what I'm doing are the page count and the themes. So there's an editorial calendar that comes out each year that kind of does an overview of the different themes for each month, and some of them are more fixed and some of them are more open to being shaped. So in this case, I was given the kind of starting point that February was supposed to be about institutional/construction projects. And my interpretation of that as these articles started to filter in was to look at new cultural institutions, and I focused on Montreal partially because I'm very new at this job, and I just came from Montreal, so it was the place where I was most intimately familiar with what was going on. And then the page count at the bottom is something that's given to me by my publisher every month, and that's the count that we're aiming for in terms of editorial pages that I'm responsible for either writing or commissioning. I should say along with my associate editor, Leslie Jen. So some of those things are fixed: cover, contents, viewpoint is an editorial piece that I'm responsible for each month. And the back page is something that's a fixture in the magazine, as those of you who've taken a look at it will know. The back page is a bit of a wild card, and then in between, the most substantial things are these feature pieces, which we have 3 of them lined up for February, and the report that you see, the third item from the bottom is what we'd call a department. So that allows us to focus more on, sometimes in this case, a show report, from the Chelsea show in Italy, the tile show. Other times we'll do technical pieces, which Terry Meyer-Boak is very familiar with, having authored at least several of them, I believe. Sometimes we'll do practice pieces, so pieces that are really more specific to our professional. I mean, all of the entire magazine is targeted at a professional readership of either practicing architects or architecture students or people that are otherwise involved in architecture research. But I would say that, an article on, how the new version of LEED affects models of practice would be something that's very specific to professional architects in Canada, for instance. So in this case, there's the other thing I want to talk about how these feature articles come about, because the features in the departments are the things that are probably the most interesting for you, and the back page as well, because that's often where we hire freelance contributors, and we do hire freelancers for, I would say, 80%, a good percentage of the magazine, because our staff is extremely tiny. So there's usually a mix of people that have been regular writers for the magazine, and something that I'm trying to do as editor is to bring on some new voices. So, and I'm discovering that it's helpful to have a balance of people who are experienced in writing for the magazine, and you can kind of send them an email and they'll be able to run with it with very little guidance, and people where I feel like my role as an editor is a bit of a coach. So in walking them through the publishing process and the writing process, and working more actively with them to shape that article. And I think, and when I talk about shaping articles, I have a certain editorial voice in the magazine as well, in terms of, if I'm doing commissioning a review of the Musée des Beaux-Arts Pavilion, then there's hundreds of different directions that article could take. My bias as a University of Waterloo grad is towards cultural history and towards broader context, and for me, building reviews are most interesting when they start to talk about larger issues, be those cultural, social, political, or say broader landscape urban issues. So, in this case, I'd like to, I'll just tell you where these three articles came from, to give you an idea. So the Musée des Beaux-Arts Pavilion is a pavilion that, in this case, it's just a really important building in Montreal. Any new museum tends to be an important physical and cultural presence in a city. And it also won a Canadian Architect Award of Excellence 2 years back, so it's been on the radar of the magazine since then. Tanya Southcott, the author for that piece, is a longtime contributor to the magazine and also a Waterloo grad. So she started contributing back pages back in 2008 when she was in Vancouver, and has been contributing since. The Quartier du Spectacle is an incredibly important urban project in Montreal right now. And Nick Luca is a professor at McGill and a new writer for the magazine. And his name came across my radar because the director of McGill, I was asking her for names of potential new writers, and she said, well, there's this prof at our school, Nick Luca, who's an excellent writer. And and he also happens to be teaching urban design as well as architecture, so I thought he was a good fit for this much broader urban piece. Centre Phi came across my radar because it was by a young firm that I've been following, Atelier in Situ in Montreal, and I decided to take on that piece just out of personal interest in that story and in these kind of smaller scale cultural institutions in Montreal, and the evolution of private patronage, say, in Montreal. So, and I should mention the back page as well. In this case, the back page is the winning text by of a small competition that's run by the Maison de l'Architecture de Québec in Montreal. So this is their second annual edition of a writing competition that has to do with new Quebec architecture. So I was part of, Ian Chodikoff, my predecessor, was on the jury last year, and I was invited to be on the jury this year. And as a means of supporting and encouraging those young voices, we agreed to publish that winning text. So we fit it in as a back page. Because the Symphony Orchestra building has been reviewed in Canadian Architect already, we decided to put it in this kind of wild card category, and we also commissioned a new photograph by a student at McGill to accompany it. So I'll just walk you through how, very briefly, how the Beaux-Arts article came together. what we'll start very early on doing is I'll have a conversation with the writer about the direction of the piece. So, in this case, what seemed to be crucial is that there is really two parts to this building. Restored heritage, a component of it that was an old church that was restored into a concert hall, and then this kind of marble block that you see at the back, which is an art gallery space, stacked galleries. So and so in this case, Tanya would take that and would meet with the architect to see the building and start to shape her piece. While that's going on, I'll be in contact with the architect to get a series of photos and drawings from them, and I'll be already starting on the layout with our graphic artist. So it's a templated magazine. We work on 2 columns and 3 columns and fit things within that template. And we have kind of standard typeface and a standard graphics that we use. So, this is kind of just a first draft of jigging around those images and seeing how they might play on the page. At some point, I'll get the text from the writer, Tanya, and I'll go through and do an edit of this. And typically, I found that, it'll be 1 or 2 rounds of editing. Some editors, work differently. So sometimes, I remember when I was submitting my piece to Ian, he was a very light editor. I think I'm probably a little bit more intense. But I've seen some editors that are extremely intense, and you'd see this page completely covered with red. So hopefully, I'm trying to steer a middle ground somewhere there as an editor, where I'll be changing things. Sometimes just to suit stylistic conventions that we have within the magazine, so use of dashes, spelling, use of use of commas, and so on. I'll be filling in information, so like the names of architects or reordering those names, and then sometimes I'll have things that I'll be eliminating word repetition, or I'll have some questions like you see in bold in the 3rd paragraph here, like a passage that doesn't quite work for me, or a sentence, an area where I think maybe it belongs in a different part of the piece. So they'll circle back to the writer. And then here you have a more final layout of that piece. So, and that's it for this brief presentation, I guess. Yeah.
Thanks, Elsa.
Sure.